There's an unsettling truth that lurks beneath the surface of many human actions. Not all of them are driven by a desire to thrive. In fact, some may be shaped by an unconscious pull toward harm, not in an overt or dramatic way, but as a quiet undercurrent beneath our choices. This isn't about conscious decisions to give up or self-destruct. It's more elusive and more troubling. It's as if, deep within the human mind, there exists a subtle but relentless force drawing us back into suffering, into repeating old wounds, into self-sabotage. Almost as if, in some strange way, the weight of conflict feels more familiar, perhaps even more tolerable, than peace. In earlier psychological models, much emphasis was placed on the notion that we instinctively avoid pain and pursue pleasure. It was a tidy framework. Suffering was seen as a glitch, something unnatural to be fixed. And for a time, that model made sense. But then came the contradictions, stories of people who crumble right at the doorstep of success, patterns that repeat in love and life, always ending in hurt. Cycles that don't just happen once, but return, like fate. These are the cracks in the comforting idea that humans are always trying to feel better. Sometimes, it seems, we're driven by something else entirely. There are moments when people seem to trip just before crossing the finish line. Relationships fall into the same damaging routines, almost as if scripted. Setbacks emerge not by coincidence, but with a strange sense of inevitability, right when progress felt within reach. These aren't simply mistakes. They feel like patterns, recurring, relentless. At this point, one of the boldest ideas in depth psychology comes into view. What if our inner life isn't solely governed by a quest for happiness or relief? What if, beneath our conscious awareness, there's a pull toward undoing, toward stillness, or even erasure? This drive wouldn't announce itself directly. Instead, it might wear the masks of shame, failure, repeated missteps, or quiet acts of self-sabotage. It's not an idea that brings comfort. It won't reassure you with easy hope. But its disturbing clarity lies in how well it explains the unspoken, the unseen patterns we live out, the quiet forces that resist healing when, on the surface, we say we want to heal. At the heart of our mental life, there seems to be an ancient mechanism, instinctive, yet remarkably precise, that steers us toward whatever brings relief and away from whatever brings distress. This isn't about chasing indulgence. It's about releasing pressure, calming inner chaos, and maintaining some sense of internal balance. Pleasure, in this context, is less about delight and more about the easing of tension. For a long time, this model seemed to explain much of human behavior. A baby cries and is soothed by feeding. An adult, overwhelmed, reaches for distraction or escape. We avoid discomfort not just out of choice, but as if wired to do so. These reflexes, subtle or overt, suggest an underlying rule quietly shaping our decisions. Freud believed this tendency emerges early, before language, before reason, and continues to shape the unconscious well into adulthood. But as we grow, something else steps in. A more mature system, one that recognizes life isn't just about immediate relief. He called this the reality principle. It doesn't cancel the drive for comfort. It refines it. It teaches patience, compromise, and the difficult art of postponing gratification in the service of long-term survival and success. We eventually come to learn that not all desires can or should be fulfilled instantly. Part of growing up is recognizing that immediate satisfaction often needs to be postponed. that short-term discomfort might pave the way for deeper, more enduring rewards. This is how we begin to regulate our impulses, weigh our decisions, and shape long-term goals. It's what helps us function in society, maintain relationships, and build meaningful lives. Yet, even with this maturity, the underlying engine remains, the deep-seated urge to avoid pain and pursue ease. For a while, this framework seemed to make sense. But as Freud delved deeper into the psyche, both his own and his patients', he noticed troubling patterns that didn't fit neatly into this model. People were not always moving toward pleasure or adapting to reality. In fact, many were stuck in loops of suffering. They repeated harmful choices. They reenacted old wounds. Not by chance, but as if driven by something hidden and persistent. Even when the source of trauma had been acknowledged, even when healing seemed within reach, some individuals found themselves slipping further into distress. Nightmares would return, behaviors would regress, and symptoms would intensify. It was as though another force was at play, one that neither sought comfort nor respected reason. A force that aimed not to heal, but to undo, pulling the psyche back to a state of emptiness or inertia, as if the mind were attempting to erase itself and start over. From these puzzling patterns, Freud found himself confronting the limits of his own framework. Something wasn't aligning. Again and again, people behaved in ways that didn't protect their well-being or promote happiness. They made choices that defied the logic of survival and ran counter to the instinct for joy. It became clear that the existing theory, focused on pleasure and adaptation, was incomplete. To account for what he was witnessing, Freud introduced a bold and deeply unsettling idea. One that didn't live on the surface of thought or offer tidy reassurance. Instead, it turned inward, toward the murky depths of the unconscious. He proposed that within the psyche lies a silent current, not oriented toward healing or integration, but toward undoing, decay, and dissolution. This is the idea we now explore more closely, the notion that beneath our desire to live, there may exist a parallel force that quietly works against it. A force that surfaces not only during crisis, but sometimes most clearly when life appears to be stable. Freud would eventually call this undercurrent the death drive, a term meant to capture something deeper than despair, something woven into the fabric of the psyche itself. Even after years of holding firm to a model where the mind sought balance between pleasure and reality, Freud began to notice the cracks. Suffering that returned again and again, not as a meaningful response, not as a path to growth, but as a pattern with no clear benefit, no rational purpose. It was as if the psyche itself contained a loop that defied resolution, demanding to be repeated. Freud began noticing a peculiar and troubling trend among his patients. Some seemed caught in cycles of reliving their deepest wounds. It was as though they were following an internal script, written by past pain, unable to deviate. There was no visible reward, no comfort, no healing, just repetition, regression, and emotional collapse. The same pain returned, not as memory, but as reenactment. This observation led Freud to a radical rethinking of his entire theory. He proposed the existence of a hidden force within the psyche, one not aimed at pleasure or progress, but at disintegration. A kind of inner gravity pulling the mind toward stillness, numbness, or even psychic erasure. This wasn't a metaphorical concept. It was a structural principle of the psyche. He later referred to it as the death drive, a term pointing to the mind's strange capacity to lean, in some cases, not toward life, but away from it. This perspective, while grounded in psychoanalysis, invites dialogue with other views on human nature. Freud proposed a theory rooted purely in psychology, without reference to theology or faith. However, through the lens of Christian belief, we understand that human beings are created not to self-destruct, but to live, love, and grow in communion with others. While psychology offers tools to observe patterns of suffering, faith reminds us that we are made for more than survival. We are made for redemption. What does this mean in real terms? It suggests that not all our behaviors serve survival. Beneath the layers of desire and fear, there may be an impulse, silent, persistent, that longs not to thrive, but to disappear. This tendency shows up in subtle but damaging ways, in choices that undo our progress, in dependencies that drain rather than soothe, in self-defeating loops we can't seem to escape. It's not something we choose consciously. This drive doesn't arrive with warnings or declarations. It seeps into daily life, into the decision to stay in toxic dynamics, into the reflex to destroy something good, right as it's blooming, into the compulsion to repeat what once broke us. These moments, irrational on the surface, may reveal the influence of something deeper than the will to live, the urge to let go entirely. There is a strange pull, an urge to revisit the very wounds that once tore us apart, as though by walking through the same fire again, we might finally extinguish it. But instead of liberation, we find ourselves back in the loop. Familiar suffering, familiar collapse. It's not healing, it's haunting. This force moves against our sense of self, against stability, against the very structure that holds our inner world together. Freud noticed this pattern in many forms. War veterans haunted by nightmares, reliving horrors long past. Children reenact in the pain of loss by staging it in play, as though trying to grasp something that still confuses them. Adults, on the edge of breakthrough, somehow pulling themselves back into the grip of old symptoms. These weren't conscious choices, they weren't rational decisions. And that was exactly the point. This wasn't behavior governed by logic or growth. It came from somewhere deeper, beneath reason, beneath will. Because it was unconscious, it carried immense power. That's what made it so frightening and so difficult to uproot. Among Freud's most controversial insights was this, that within each person might lie a force not aimed at flourishing, but at undoing, a force that contradicts the comforting belief that we are always moving toward wholeness or progress. Many rejected this idea. It didn't fit the hopeful narrative of self-improvement. It challenged the very image of what it means to be human. But maybe that's what makes it so honest, because it doesn't turn away from the shadows. It acknowledges the chaos we all carry, the places inside us where logic breaks down, and where suffering, for reasons we don't fully understand, keeps finding its way back in. This internal force doesn't operate in isolation. It reveals itself through recognizable patterns, some of which are hauntingly familiar. One of the most mysterious among them is repetition. We find ourselves circling back to the same wounds, the same emotional traps, the very dynamics we once vowed never to endure again. And yet, we return. Not by design, but as if drawn by an invisible thread. Why does this happen? Why do we reenact what hurt us most? At first glance, these repetitions seem like lapses in judgment, emotional glitches, moments where something in us misfires. But from a psychoanalytic perspective, they are far more than accidents. They are signals, not malfunctions, but mechanisms. The unconscious mind doesn't behave like the rational one. It doesn't adapt by learning from the past or making calculated choices. Instead, it loops, and in that looping lies a kind of language, one not spoken, but enacted. Through repeated behaviors, the psyche is attempting to revisit and rework an experience that remains unresolved, unfinished. Freud described this process as a compulsion, an urge to relive past events not for enjoyment, but as if trying to decode a message buried inside them. As if each repetition might somehow restore coherence to something that once broke us. The mind, stuck in the echo of trauma, acts out the same play again and again, not to suffer, but to finally find a different ending. It's like a stage play that never closes. Same cast, same roles, same ending, no matter how many times it's performed. The characters may shift in form, but the story stays the same. Deep down, the psyche whispers, "Maybe this time I'll get it right. Maybe this time I'll stay in control. Maybe this time I'll walk away unharmed." But the original wound, what started the whole performance, isn't part of the present. It lives outside of time, trapped in the unconscious like a frozen frame from a forgotten film. Until that buried wound is fully brought into awareness, it continues to echo through our lives. It demands reenactment, like an unresolved spirit haunting the mind, and it shows up in recognizable forms. People who keep finding themselves in toxic relationships, drawn to partners that echo the emotional chaos of childhood. Not because they want it, but because some part of them has never left that early scene. Others might find themselves on the verge of success only to sabotage the opportunity, as if achieving something meaningful triggers an internal warning. Freud recognized this not as failure, but as a deep inner effort to master something that was once overwhelming. To repeat, hoping that repetition might bring closure. But the repetition often comes with a hidden punishment, as though the very act of wanting, striving, or breaking old boundaries sparks a guilt so subtle it's almost invisible. Guilt for reaching too far, for desiring what once felt forbidden, or for daring to heal. In this way, the drive toward destruction and the weight of guilt become entangled. The mind turns against itself. Pain becomes a kind of payment, an unconscious effort to balance a scale we don't even realize exists. And the more we hurt, the more we unknowingly reinforce this pattern of inner penance. That's what makes these cycles so hard to escape. It's not just about ending the suffering. It's about understanding it. About uncovering the scene that keeps being replayed and recognizing what unfinished business still seeks resolution. Yet even with this insight, one question lingers. Why do some remain trapped, while others slowly begin to break free? What divides the person who repeats from the one who transforms? The answer may lie in something hidden, something subtle and powerful. The pull to identify with pain so completely that letting it go feels like losing oneself. There comes a point when repeated pain begins to transform. It no longer functions solely as discomfort or warning. It starts to take root. It becomes familiar. So much so that it stops being just something we feel and starts becoming something we are. And that's what we explore next, how the human psyche, paradoxically, can treat pain like home, a place that feels known, predictable, even safe. This is not addiction in the ordinary sense, not a craving for suffering, not a conscious attachment to misery. It's deeper than that. It's a psychological architecture shaped by repetition, where pain weaves itself into identity. Over time, the person doesn't just experience suffering, they build a sense of self around it. Freud recognized that for many individuals, emotional pain wasn't simply a response to past wounds. It was the very scaffold of who they believed themselves to be. The self constructed around memories of neglect, shame, loss, or exclusion becomes fragile and rigid. And when that painful image of self is internalized, the idea of letting it go can feel like psychological annihilation. This is why, even after long periods of apparent healing, people may find themselves slipping back into familiar forms of self-destruction the moment true change becomes possible. It's not laziness, it's not weakness, it's fear. A fear rooted in the unconscious, fear of stepping into a life unrecognizable to the self that has always known pain as its compass. The mind, in such cases, forms invisible contracts with suffering, not out of desire, but out of survival. Because when pain has shaped your identity, the absence of it can feel like erasure. Over time, pain can become more than just a wound. It becomes an anchor. The individual, unsure of who they are without that suffering, keeps returning to it like an addict returns to their fix. Not because it brings relief, but because it offers a strange familiarity. In some cases, especially for those raised in unstable or emotionally tangled environments, pain becomes tied to love. Affection is earned through distress. Approval is purchased with self-sacrifice. Attention is conditional on suffering. In such early settings, the mind learns a brutal equation. To be noticed, one must hurt. This belief doesn't remain conscious, but it lives on, shaping adult choices and relationships. Freud once remarked that the neurotic is torn between seeking pleasure and needing punishment. And for those trapped in this dynamic, that paradox is all too real. They long for joy, for peace, for a lighter way of being. Yet somewhere deep within, there is a shadow, a voice whispering that such happiness is undeserved, that to want too much is to invite punishment. So suffering becomes a kind of penance, a silent attempt to restore emotional balance by paying for guilt that may not even have a name. Escaping this pattern isn't simply a matter of motivation. It takes courage, the kind that demands facing one's earliest pain. It means confronting the question, who am I without this pain? What remains when the suffering stops? What identity lies behind the wound? These are not questions with easy answers, but they are necessary. Because if suffering becomes identity, the path to freedom isn't denial, it's transformation. And this brings us to a central idea. If the pain is tied so deeply to who we are, can we ever be free of it? Freud didn't offer a naive yes. He didn't believe in quick fixes or pretty illusions, but he did offer a path, the possibility of elaboration, a process through which the unconscious is brought into awareness and repetition becomes something we can name, understand, and, over time, reframe. This process is about bringing hidden forces to light, making the unseen visible. Because what is hidden dominates silently, but what is seen can be worked with. And in Freud's view, that moment of recognition, lucidity, is the first step toward any real liberation. This isn't the kind of freedom we often imagine. It's not a life without struggle. But it is a life where the chains begin to loosen, because we finally see them. The death drive, this inner current that resists life, can't be removed. It's part of the architecture of the psyche. But it doesn't have to rule us. It can be spoken of, understood, translated. And that is the work of analysis, to face what has been avoided, to find language for the silent compacts we've made with pain, and to give shape to what once only repeated itself. As awareness deepens, something begins to shift. The person starts to find space, mental and emotional, to move. What once felt like fate begins to take on structure, meaning, even language. The loop of repetition doesn't vanish, but it starts to speak. It can be examined, understood, redefined. But this turning point doesn't come from sheer will or blind optimism. It requires something far more difficult, the courage to return to the roots of pain, to look closely at guilt that has been buried, desires that were denied, and truths about the self that have long been avoided. Freud likened this inner journey to mourning, not just grieving a loss, but truly facing it, acknowledging what was taken, making sense of it, and then, perhaps slowly, allowing oneself to carry on without erasing the past. When pain is processed in this way, it doesn't vanish into thin air. It finds a new place. It becomes part of the story, not a force that silently dictates from the shadows. In this transformation, what was once a disruptive symptom becomes a narrative thread. What used to feel like a compulsion beyond control is now a choice that can be made differently. Silent suffering, long hidden, begins to emerge as conscious insight. Freud witnessed this shift in his own clinical work. People who had been trapped by repetition gradually finding other ways to live, simply by giving form and voice to what had always remained unspoken. This is not magic. It's not instant. It's a slow interior labor. But it is real. And yet, perhaps the most difficult part of this process comes after the suffering has receded. When pain is no longer the center of identity, something else appears in its place. Emptiness. A stillness where agony used to live. And here lies a profound challenge. Many people return to suffering, not because they love it, but because that silence feels more terrifying. Pain, as terrible as it is, can be known. It offers structure. But the unknown, the void, that is harder to face. Yet in that very emptiness, a possibility arises. The chance to build, not as a reaction to wounds, but from the freedom to create something entirely new. This is what Freud pointed to when he said, "Where the id was, the ego shall be," meaning, where chaos once ruled, clarity and agency can grow. But understanding this with the mind is not enough. Knowledge alone does not tame the unconscious. To truly shift these forces, they must be engaged directly. They must be brought into the symbolic realm, named, confronted, and crossed. This brings us to the final and most essential step, learning what it means to bring the unconscious into awareness, and why that might be the only path to reclaiming authorship of one's life. In his later work, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Freud proposed something that remains unsettling even now, that all life carries within it a quiet pull toward stillness, a drift back toward the lifeless state from which it came. This was not meant as metaphor. It was a clinical and philosophical claim. He called this force the death drive, the invisible axis around which many of our most self-defeating patterns revolve. It explains why change is so difficult, why destruction repeats, and why inner freedom demands more than desire. It demands depth. This is exactly why Freud believed that the only way to loosen the grip of unconscious forces is to bring them into the light of awareness, not through motivational slogans or the suppression of discomfort, The unconscious doesn't yield to optimism or denial. It responds to real work, the work of naming, of witnessing, of carefully unfolding what has long been hidden. In this process, pain is no longer treated as an enemy to be destroyed, but as a message, one whose meaning may not yet be fully known, but which must be heard. Repetition, then, isn't a sign of failure. It's the psyche trying to express what it hasn't yet been able to fully process. Pain becomes a kind of encrypted message, and decoding it is what allows us to shift from being bound by it to making sense of it. This is where change begins, not by altering the surface of our lives, but by transforming what lies underneath. When someone starts to notice their patterns, when they begin to understand the emotional roots of their behavior and face the guilt they've avoided, they begin to taste a different kind of freedom. Not a flawless freedom, but one grounded in awareness, lucid, fragile, real. And with that clarity comes something more demanding: accountability. Because once you see the source of your pain, you can no longer assign it only to others or to fate. You start to see there's a story running within you, a script. And that story, while not erasable, can be rewritten. Not by pretending it never happened, but by truly understanding its depth and its hold. If you've come this far in the journey, chances are something within you has already begun to shift. So take a moment to pause and reflect. What idea challenged you? What insight made you stop? Sometimes simply writing it down, giving shape to what you feel, is what begins the process of transformation. Don't stop here. Each step further into awareness unmasks another layer. And the more you come to see what was once silent, the less power it has to shape your life without your consent. There are pains we cannot avoid, but when we dare to listen to them, to read them, and to name them with honesty, a path begins to open, even in the dark. A path that does not lead us out of suffering right away, but one that takes us through it, to a place where pain no longer decides our destiny.